Thank you, Ted. Well, welcome to June 9th and a journey into the last few weeks of spring. And as we enter into kind of this season where we celebrate what God has been doing, this Sunday coming, June 16th, we have our annual barbecue, fun times outside. It is Grad and Dad Sunday, so we get to celebrate both with grads and fathers. That's one announcement I want to make for making sure that you guys come and enjoy the experience, not just at 10 o'clock, but again, afterwards with our barbecue, fun, and games. And then as we enter into the summer, we're going to be entering into a kind of a Proverbs teaching series beyond the Sunday mornings. Every morning from Monday through Friday, we'll be reading through the book of Proverbs, 31 books in Proverbs. We're going to stretch it out over the entire summer. Now, one thing that we had done in the past as a congregation, which a lot of people really enjoyed, is the participation level of those that inputted into that. So what we're desiring to do is a 5-day reading plan for the entire summer, and that'll be working through the book of Proverbs. But I need your input on that. So at the back of the sanctuary, by the Connect table, there is an opportunity for you to sign up for a particular proverb. Now, if there's one that you've got on mind and you really enjoy, go ahead and fill your name out beside that, and the date's going to be there. And then you'll be inputting that information into an overall book that we'll be passing out on a weekly basis, whether through social media or email, so that people will be able to participate. And so we'll wake up on Monday morning and read, say, Proverbs chapter 1, and someone from the congregation will be giving their thoughts about that particular passage. So give thought to that on how you can participate in that. My desire is that either this Sunday or next, you guys begin to fill that in. It'll be available again next week, and then we'll begin to participate together throughout the summer. Because we are in fellowship together. It is a state of being a church. Again, that word ship comes from the idea of a state of being in fellowship, a state of being together. And we're going to be walking through today again and then next week of the different ideas of courtship, friendship, mentorship, fellowship, partnership, relationship, and companionship. And as we think about next week in the relationship we have with our kids, particularly our daughter as she graduates next week, and many of us have that relationship. And then again, fathership, whatever that might look like, the state of being a dad. Next week we get to celebrate that. Really excited about that. But there's only one opportunity that gives us these abilities to be a dad and a parent, is the idea of courtship. There's a journey that we all go through as we begin relationship with someone that will become our closest person. And this stage of relationship is called courtship, coming from the idea of royalty. Royalty, that's why it's called courtship. To become a spouse of someone that's in royalty, you were groomed into that process. It was courtship. And today we use that idea of courtship, of the beginning stages of a greater relationship. And relationship is so important. It begins to create within us a state of being. Our friends identify with us as friends, and that begins to create the identity. Beyond friends, there's those people that you go to work with, and just the different states of relationship. For me, the fellowship within the church is so key to who I am as a pastor and as a human being. This is the church that God has called me to, and each one of you that are listening to my voice right now are called into fellowship together. I was asked this past week, headed up to Cavendish for what we call Cavendish 250. The larger churches of the Baptist denomination gather together at Cavendish every year and just encourage each other and begin to build relationship together. And I was asked about KBC and how things have gone. It's been 9 years that I've been here in this journey. And as you guys know, there's been some rocky states within KBC. And that's the interesting part about this, is even the diagram that we have for our sermon series, that when we get into relationship, the state of that relationship sometimes gets very rocky, stormy as such. But for us as a church, when I was asked about how things are going at KBC, I really responded with the fellowship at our church is probably at the best it's been. And when the fellowship of the church is centered around Jesus, then you have unity. I believe the state of our fellowship is really healthy right now. And not only fellowship being centered on Jesus, all relationships, including friendships, when they're centered on Jesus, there creates a sense of unity. Becky and I's relationship has about 21 years now. I believe that the state of our relationship is really good, although as the picture would signify, there's been a lot of rocky states in our relationship. There's been some storms along the way, mostly because I've made mistakes, not Becky. Mostly because of her impatience with me as her husband has created the perfect state of relationship. And it's been a journey for us as a couple. And as we begin to think about our own relationships, we have to begin to see our relationships as something that God has brought together. That when we begin to see that our friendships, our partnerships, all of these ships, when they come together, we have to begin to see that God has ordained that to come together. And then when you think about it that way, that God has brought us together, you begin to see certain things that are vitally important. Like the fact that you have the same vision as a couple or a friends. Or as friends, you have the same vision, the same goals, the same commitment. And then last week I talked about this idea of the bait of Satan. Satan does not desire unity in any of these states. Satan desires to break these, and so he begins to throw in some seeds of doubt. And when he begins to throw in some seeds of doubt, there begins to have this idea that we are not united together. And then so two key sentences or key words have to come into every state. And these are the two key words. And you've probably used them several times. I've used them in my own relationships. These two words, sorry, and I forgive you. Two of the most key words in any state, especially stormy states of relationships. And then when you use these two key lines, I'm sorry or I forgive you, you bring Jesus back into the equation. Again, when relationship is centered on Jesus, you have unity. So today we're going to talk a little bit about courtship. Now, I know a few of us are a little bit beyond that stage of life. There's a certain level of, I won't go too far into this, but we're into this relationship so far, but courtship is no longer something we think back on those days, but it was about finding the perfect person. So if you're with the perfect person right now, I just kind of want you to look at them and say, oh, you're the perfect person. If you're standing, you're sitting beside them, maybe hold their hand and just like, oh, I love you. You have such perfect unity. For my wife and I, 21 years. I think to myself, that's a pretty long journey. Many of us have been able to experience loving someone for that long. And I know there's a lot of people in this place right now that there's a little bit of a struggle that, well, let me just think to myself, 21 years. Is there anybody in the room? If you are, I want to just acknowledge this right now. If you've been married for longer than 21 years, can you do me a favor? Can you stand up? Right now, we just want to acknowledge a little 21 more years. So I want to think of all these journeys. Think 21 years. Okay, good. Okay, let's go with 25. If you've been married for longer than 25 years, go ahead and keep standing up. If you've been less than 25 years, go ahead and sit down. 30 years. Any 30 years journeys in this room? 30? 35 years. 35 years of marriage, yeah? 35. 40 years of marriage. 40 years of marriage. Let's go to 45 years of marriage. 45? Wow, not a whole lot of people sat down here. There's a big gap here. 50 years of marriage. 50 years of marriage. I want 50. Okay. How about this? If you've been married for 60 years. Okay, we're closing it off. Oh, wait. Oh, yeah. Chester had to sit down after Nancy. And Jim, yeah, let's go. Yes. That's awesome. Can you think back to your courtship days now? 60 years ago, can you think back to those days where you began to look at someone differently? where you begin to see that you can begin to see the vision of a future together, where you can begin to see that you had the same dreams, the same passions, the same desires that would last well over 50 years. Now, during that stage, I'm sure there's a lot of state of stormy times, and I'm sure that the words sorry and I forgive you were used many times. And those discoveries happens in the courtship. Will I be able to say sorry to this person an infinite amount of times? Will I be able to say, I forgive you to this person an infinite amount of times? I think when it comes to these particular relationships that last a long time, those are two key words that we'll say over and over and over again and not get tired of using them. Because relationships begin to break down when we get tired of saying these words. Right? And that's where the storm of these relationships come in. So we're going to talk a little bit about what it takes to have a lasting relationship. What does it take to have something that God has ordained and that you begin to see Jesus in everything that you do and that you're equally yoked? This would be so much easier if we open up the Bible and see a chapter or verse or book of the Bible that talked about Jesus dating. Right? I mean, it'd be so much easier if we could just say, okay, yeah, you remember that one time that Jesus went on a date or many dates or whatever that looked like? We don't have those examples. We don't actually see any relationship that Jesus had outside of his particular disciples. So Jesus never dated in Scripture. And there was no evidence of it at all. But if Jesus dated, the one key thing that Scripture would talk about is this. 2 Corinthians talks into the idea, chapter 6, verse 14, to be equally yoked. To be equally yoked. And the idea behind this is the yoke that would be put on cattle when they're plowing fields. While two cattle are yoked together, they must have the same vision, the same dreams, and the same direction. If you're not equally yoked, there's a separation that happens, and there's a strain that continues, and that partnership cannot work out. When it comes to equally yoked, the highest form of that is having the same beliefs, the same desire to raise a family in those beliefs. A lot of times, especially in the Christian world, our desire is that when we become in courtship with someone, that they have the same belief in Jesus. That's what Paul's talking about here, I believe, when he says to create an equally yoked relationship in courtship. Now, key here, we live in a broken world. And people often have the best intentions in this broken world. But then they fail to meet some of the expectations. And so the beginning process of courtship is feeling out, does this person really have the same beliefs as I do? Now, as we go through this journey of relationship, we really want to look at the story of David. Last week we talked about 5 key friends that David had. And today we're going to talk about 5 key relationships that David had and use him as a opposite of example, if you know what I'm talking about. We're going to talk about the life that David had and begin to say, let's not do the things that David had to do in relationship. Today's world, if you go on App Store or Google Play Store and search up dating apps, some people in this room might have a dating app on their phone. I'm not sure. I don't. Just to be clear. So I had to look up the different names of dating apps that exist, like Bumble or Hinge or OkCupid, Match.com, eHarmony, Plenty of Fish, and then, of course, Coffee Meets Bagel. Have you heard of this one? Coffee Meets Bagel, very interesting, where I guess you go for coffee with your bagel and have anyways, I won't get too far into it. But then there's, of course, Christian Mingle, right? For us Christians out there that are looking for someone to date. So when we go into this conversation about David, I want to highly suggest one thing. There's one app out there that has met the needs of so many people in so many wrong ways. Of course, it's Tinder. And I would like to argue the fact that if David existed in this world today, I'm suggesting that he probably downloaded Tinder. I'm like, you might understand, just as we go into this conversation about David, why he may have had Tinder on his phone. As we talked about his friends last week, and we talked about the different relationships he had in those, and we continue this stormy understanding, we begin to see David's relationships and the difficulties that he faced, and there was always something that was a key issue. When looking at relationships that go beyond the first stages, David, I think, forgot about the conversation about equally yoked. Now, he had some rocky relationships that went beyond friendships, but at the same time, David, when we first meet him, is a man after God's own heart. That's how he's introduced. As Samuel is going to look for the next king of Israel, God identifies David as a man after God's own heart. So if that's the case, and that's the example that we have for our lives to live, we have to begin to think if he's a man after God's own heart, he doesn't make any mistakes, right? False. Like us all, David had his struggles, and ultimately, involvement with women became the cause of many of his hardships that he faced. So the biblical truth is every woman in our lives causes us the biggest grief, right, men? Don't say anything. It's a trap, you're right. David had many struggles. And again, if David had Tinder, he seemed to struggle ultimately with swiping right more than he swiped left, if you know what I'm talking about. Those that have been married for 60 years probably have no idea what I'm talking about. And just to be clear, I've never downloaded Tinder and never swiped left or right. But if I were to have Tinder, I probably would swipe only right on Becky. Right answer. So today we want to look at the courtship of David and how some of us who are now happily married could have learned some lessons from it, and those who are still on the journey can definitely learn lessons from it. Because the mistakes people make help us, not only them, to learn lessons. Again, the mistakes people make not only help them, but help people learn lessons from them when we hear the stories and also learn from them. So again, where did David swipe right when he should have swiped left? Because Tinder is used widely throughout the world and available in over 190 countries in 56 languages. And as of September 2021, an estimated 75 million people have used the app every month. 12 million matches per day. What does this lead to? Well, I think it leads to a couple things. The opposite of equally yoked would be what Tinder often creates. And then it is also learned to one key brokenness in this world. It's led to short-term, sex-prioritized relationships. We may feel that this is new, but in fact, it has always been. Although Tinder has not existed forever, this idea of short-term relationships is something that is not uncommon. The word porneia in the New Testament is what leads us to understanding sexual immorality. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 13 to 18. I want to jump into this conversation because in today's broken world, this is what has led us to where we're at today. And this is what's created the division. So when we talk about the state of relationship and brokenness, this is often the key to the brokenness within courtship. So 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 13. has these words. I'll start with verse 12. Everything is permissible for me, but not everything is beneficial. Everything is permissible for me, but I will not be the mastered by anything. Food for the stomach and stomach for the food, for God will destroy them both. The body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. By his power, God raised the Lord from the dead, and he will raise us also. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ himself? Shall I then take the members of Christ and unite them with a prostitute? Never. Do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her in body? For it is said, the two will become one flesh. But he who unites himself with the Lord is the one with him in spirit. Key here, flee from all sexual immorality. All other sins a man commits are outside his body, but he who sins sexually sins against his own body. One thing that's interesting about the New Testament compared to the Old Testament is there is no transitional line between what we would consider monogamous relationships, which is pretty common nowadays. The New Testament is the first actual scripture to prioritize monogamy. While the Old Testament includes examples of polygamous marriages, which is what we find with David, the New Testament introduces the teachings that emphasize this monogamy understanding. Over time, these teachings influence Christian doctrine and practice, leading to widespread acceptance of monogamy. My guess is everybody in this room that's been married for any period of time has only been married to one woman at a time. I hope I'm guessing right on this one. Now, this transition to this idea of monogamy was influenced both by scripture interpretation and developing traditions of the early church. This is something that has just grown into the understanding. But I think just for common sense, we just got smart about it. I'm just saying we got smart about it because, to be honest with you, I could probably only handle one wife. But David, we read, well, he was able to, do it many times over. And we think to ourselves, how can a man after God's own heart have so many women on his mind? Now, we can't point to David's multiple partners as sins because, again, monogamy is something that has been created through the process of understanding what God really wants. So in David's time, this idea was pretty common. So to point to multiple wives as sin to David would be reaching a little bit. But to be honest, David's making a lot of mistakes here. However, David's example helps us to understand that the relationships he's having draw him not closer to God, but further from him. So here's the key point when it comes to courtship. When you begin this process of journeying to see who I'm going to spend the rest of my life with, if this person draws you further away from God, you might be making a mistake. If this person draws you closer to God, God just might be in it, and you just might last 60 years. The events that highlight David's sexual relationships lead to a series of tragic outcomes. If David were to ask the question, "Are you in it, God?" well, he might just get the answer no. These have led to a series of tragic outcomes illustrating the profound and often devastating effects of relationships we get into that are not equally yoked. This affects personal sin. More importantly, it affects our whole being. Sin is a way of doing this. Any sin. We have to remember that sin separates us from God. It's that natural. Sin is something that draws us away from a relationship with God. And sex is just one of them. If you don't struggle with this area, don't check out now. Because I'm sure there is a sin that you struggle with, and the overall universal thought, and what I'm about to talk about, leads to all the conversations about sin. The key learning is this: repentance, which is what we need to learn, and this sets David apart as a man after God's own heart. Because if you just look at the sin of David, you would not see him as a man after God's own heart. But if you begin to see that the brokenness in David leads him to repentance, then you begin to see how he's a man after God's own heart. So the key is this: David was open to correction. David was open to correction. And he began to see God's grace in his life. For us to be like David, a man or a woman after God's own heart, we have to be open to correction and understand God's grace. So let's see where David should have swiped left. Let's start with Michal. Michal was David's first wife. She was the daughter of King Saul. Again, Saul was the one that David replaced. She loved David and was given to him as a wife after he defeated Goliath and fulfilled Saul's bribe price. Now, here's key number one in courtship. We talked about, key number one is equally yoked. Key number two is if the father of the woman that you're thinking of dating asks for these things, you may just want to swipe left. What are these things? Well, let's go to 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 20, and begin to see why David should have swiped left. Now Saul's daughter Michal, verse 20, was in love with David, and when they told Saul about it, he was pleased. I will give her to him, he thought, so that she may be a snare to him, and so that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. So Saul said to David, now you have a second opportunity to become my son-in-law. Then Saul ordered his attendants speak to David privately and say, look, the king is pleased with you, and his attendants all like you. Now become his son-in-law. And they repeated these words to David, but David said, do you think this is a small matter to become the king's son-in-law? I'm only a poor man and little known. When Saul's servants told him what David had said, Saul replied, say to David, the king wants no other price for the bride than 100 Philistine foreskins. Now, if your future father-in-law comes to you and asks for 100 any person's foreskins, maybe swipe left in this situation. I don't know. Sounds a little weird. Then you've got Ahinoam. You got Abigail. You got Maacah. You got Haggith. You got Abital. You got Eglah. King David had several children with all of these women and married to most of them. And they all caused significant problems and turmoil within his family and kingdom. Here are just a few key figures. Amnon. Amnon was David's firstborn son, and he was known for raping his half-sister. Consequences? The act of violence and the subsequent lack of immediate justice from David led to a deep family strife and contributed to Absalom's later rebellion. Amnon was eventually killed by Absalom in revenge for the rape. This was a relationship that was not healthy to begin with and causes consequences. When we begin this journey of courtship, if we begin to see that God is not in it, there are definitely going to be consequences down the road. I don't think they'll be as serious as this, but there will always be consequences when the state of the relationship does not have God in it. Then you got Absalom. Absalom was David's third son. He was murdered, and he murdered Amnon to avenge his sister Tamar. Later, Absalom led to a major rebellion against David and attempting to usurp the throne. Consequences, this rebellion caused civil war, significant bloodshed, and immensely personal pain for David, and Absalom ultimately killed by Joab. Now, these consequences are great, all because of a decision that David had made that he should have swiped left on. Consequences, his actions always lead to hurt. So again, how could God trust David with so many stupid relationships decisions? Well, there was a promise that God made to Israel. And that promise was, I will fulfill my promises through this man. Again, we live in a broken world. We make stupid decisions. Well, let's just jump into a little bit more of Scripture and begin to see some of the story and how it plays out. 2 Samuel chapter 6. 2 Samuel chapter 6. This is the promise. Chapter 6, verse 16. Chapter 6, verse 16. As the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David. Now again, part of the promises in this journey was the ark, which is God's presence, to make its way to Jerusalem. This was ultimately a promise. Now Michal, his first wife, Michal, daughter of Saul, watched from a window. And when she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. They brought the ark of the Lord and set it in the place inside the tent that David had pitched, and David sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings before the Lord. After he'd finished sacrificing the burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord Almighty. Then he gave a loaf of bread, a cake of dates, and a cake of raisins to each person, the whole crowd of Israelites. This is a big party, both men and women, and all the people who went into their homes. When David returned home to bless his household, again, God's promises are being fulfilled. And you never feel this way sometimes in a relationship where you think are going the right way, and then you get home. Some people know what I'm talking about. Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, how the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, derobing in the sight of the slave girls, of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would do. Again, this is his wife. And David said to Michal, it was before the Lord who chose me rather than the father of anyone of the house when he appointed me a ruler of the Lord's people of Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord. I'll be even more undignified than this, and I'll be humiliated in my own eyes. But those slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in honor. And Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children from that day. Promises are being fulfilled, but his relationship was rocky. There was a storm a-brewing. Chapter 7 talks about the covenant promises. And beyond the covenant promises, we have 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 18, where it jumps into this other conversation. When King David went in and sat before the Lord, he said, oh, who am I, O sovereign Lord? And what is my family that you have brought me this far? And if this were not enough in your sight, O sovereign Lord, you have also spoken about the future of the house of your servant. Is this your usual way of dealing with man, O sovereign Lord? What more can David say to you? For you know your servant, O sovereign Lord. This is a journey now that David is on, and he begins to see a picture of how God is in it. But one thing David speaks of, and the New Living Translation speaks this: you know what I'm really like. Even though God is following through on the promises, David has this one key understanding. God, but you know what I'm really like. You think David's got it all figured out, but then there's this one other story. 2 Samuel chapter 11. See, here's the key here. David's moving on this journey. He's fulfilling God's promises, but he's still swiping right. He's still doing these things that are drawing him away from God. And that's the thing. Make sure that any decision we make in relationships draws you closer to God, not further away. 2 Samuel chapter 11. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and they besieged the Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. Key mistake number one, the kings do not stay behind. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof on the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. Key scene here. And David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "Isn't that Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" That should have stopped David. I mean, looking at the Tinder app at this point, he sees this woman on his phone. He's like, wow, she's pretty good looking in that hot tub, right? Asks the question of his buddy, "Here, do you know who this woman is?" He says, "Oh, yeah, she's involved with somebody else." That's the key moment where David needs to take his thumb and do what? Swipe left. Right? An easy decision for David at this point, right? Swipe left, David, and then you'll go on to the next woman and swipe left. David, you should download the app. No, you shouldn't. You should delete the app because you're already on this journey with someone else. You got Michelle in your corner. No, I'm going to swipe. He doesn't delete the app. He even asked the question. He said, "This is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam." Then David sent messages to her to get her. She came to him and he slept with her. She was purified. She had purified herself from all uncleanness. Then she went back home, and the woman conceived and sent word to David, "I'm pregnant." And then David just continues the journey of growing further and further away from God. The story goes on. You can keep reading the story. He does some pretty heinous things. This is a guy who's identified as the man after God's own heart. David had no understanding of what it would be like to delete the app. He just kept swiping right. So how do we learn from this? How do we learn from a guy that we still call the man after God's own heart doing the things that would make you go, wow, that guy's any description up here would be, bleeped out of the YouTube version of what I'm about to say. But here's the key. We have always been in an age of Tinder. What I mean by that is we've been always in an age of making stupid decisions that have nothing to do with God's best interest. And when God's best interests aren't in mind in all of these relationship decisions, if God is not in it, they will always be stupid decisions. Because here's the thing. Temptation is real. What is your Bathsheba moment in your own life? What is that moment that you're staring at something like Bathsheba in a hot tub? Now, maybe it's not Bathsheba in a hot tub. Maybe it's food in the fridge. Or maybe it's something that is just drawing you in. Maybe it's that one picture that comes up on the computer and you're like, I should just click on that and it will lead me on a healthy journey, right? What is that one lie? What is that one gossip? What is that one untruth? What is that one thing in your life that is like the Bathsheba in a hot tub that even though you know you shouldn't swipe right, you end up choosing to open the fridge? Or you end up choosing to say the untruth? Or you end up choosing to break a relationship? What are those stories in your life that go beyond the sexual immorality? Because you know what? It is true that every sin is sin. Every sin separates us from God. No matter if it's porneia, if it's a lie, it's all things that separate us from God. So what do we learn from David when it comes to this story? Here it is. Romans chapter 12, verse 1. Romans chapter 12, verse 1. Why we learn from David is this. Paul says these words, "Therefore I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship." Your spiritual act of worship. Verse 2. "Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world." Here's the key thing. We've already talked about this is common. Like Tinder is a common thing. It's a common world. It's been going on since David. The pattern of this world is to draw into sin that separates us from God. Paul says, don't conform to this way of living. but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is for your life, what he really wants, the person he really wants in your life to be your partner for 60 years. If you do these things, if you conform to the pattern of God, not the pattern of the world, I will show you the relationships that you're supposed to be in. And these relationships will be good and pleasing and perfect because I'm in it. But David keeps swiping left, swiping right. Worship. Verse 1 talks about this is your spiritual act of worship. Within KBC, we have worship as one of our values, and within that value, it's the idea of worship is this. It's what God desires, not what we want. See, what we want, what David wanted, was Bathsheba. God did not desire David to have Bathsheba. David wanted Bathsheba. God desired not to have Bathsheba. David was urged by God to swipe left or delete the app. David swipes right. God's desire is for his creation to be pure. What we want is to see how close to unpure we can get without crossing the line. When it comes to this conversation, let's drop the conversation about overall sin and let's look at this sexual immorality conversation. Most times, as a pastor, I'm asked the question, well, how far is too far? What's that line? What's that line that I can get to without crossing it? Where is it that I can go to that God desires me to go to, but not any further? And here's the key thing that I try to express to everybody that has this conversation with me. God desires that you don't even get close to any line, that there is no line, that there's purity and there's impurity. David obviously crossed the line. We, as human beings, all cross the line. I'm not just talking about the sexual immorality, I'm talking about all sin. All sin is the same. In God's eyes, it separates us from him. We, in all sin, go, man, if I just open the fridge and look, is that sin? No, it's not. But guess what? That's pretty close to the line, right? Well, if I just open and smell it, how close is it to sin? Well, it's getting pretty close, but guess what? Close the fridge and find something to honor God with. That's the same for all sin. But God desires for all of us to be pure, and we desire to see how close to the line we can get. God desires, and what we want, what God desires, what we want are often at odds. And this is where David gets an odds with God. Bathsheba is the cross the line mark, but guess what? David was probably already living on the wrong side of the line the whole time. But yet, he was still a man after God's own heart. Why is it? Because God sees within every single one of us that we are all potentially men and women after God's own heart. We are all potentially that same. I don't think David is the only one. Let's go back to that conversation outflow and Phil Appleby talking about this idea that we're all created in the image of God. We all have that potential. We all have it. We all have the ability to be a man or woman after God's own heart. But yet we all fail, we're all broken, we all find ourselves in a place where we don't even think we're even close to that. And David, at the epitome of it all, at the epitome of the sin, Nathan comes to him, we'll talk about Nathan a little bit more next week. Nathan comes to him and says, David, do you know what you've done? And David responds with this psalm, Psalm 51. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. According to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions, wash away all my iniquity, and cleanse me from all sin. What made David a man after God's own heart? This ability. I'm going to invite the worship team up. Here's what God desires. God desires to make us pure. So what should we want? What makes David a man after God's own heart? Here it is. To accept the purity. To accept the purity through Jesus. We have all gone to that place where we're not even close. We need to accept the purity. David accepted he was broken. And he cries out, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love." So in all relationships, courtship, work, house, whatever it is, we need to protect the relationships we have with people by protecting the relationship we have with our Father through Jesus. We need to protect our courtships by focusing on God, protecting a relationship we have with God, and then God will protect the relationships that we have. Let's sing one.